Hello everyone, welcome to day 2 of our investigation into properties of addition and multiplication. Let's go ahead and kick things off with a word problem real quick. So you hand out 425 programs on the first night of your school's variety show, P programs on the second night, so we're not sure how many programs the second night, so we give that a variable P, and then 520 programs on the third night. We want to write a simplified expression. So since we want to find the total number of programs handed out, we know we need to add these up. So we're going to add 425 plus P plus 520. Now remember, we can combine some of these terms so that it is simplified. Remember, we can only combine constants with constants and coefficients with coefficients. So we can combine these two constants, but we have nothing to combine with the term with the variable p, because there's no other terms with p and a coefficient. So the simplified expression is p plus 945, and we're done. That is our simplified expression. All right, now there's some rules that allow us to do these types of things to simplify. And when we do these simplifications, we're actually creating what's called an equivalent expression. So equivalent expressions are expressions that simplify to the same value, therefore called equivalent. Equivalent means the same. So an equivalent expression to 5 plus 8 is 8 plus 5, because they are both equivalent to 13 when you simplify it. So x plus y is equivalent to y plus x. And that's simplified. We actually can't do anything else with those. Looking at multiplication, 9 times 3 is equivalent to 3 times 9. These are equivalent expressions because they both simplify to 27. X plus y is equivalent to y plus x. And then if we look at 5 plus x plus 8, well, that's actually equivalent to 5 plus x plus 8, because when we simplify this, we can combine those constants in both of these, and both of these expressions simplify to x plus 13. So again, when we say equivalent expressions, we're talking about expressions that simplify to the same value. Now there's some rules in algebra that we call properties that allow us to do this. So they have these fancy names, so don't let the names intimidate you at all. The first one is called the commutative property, which says that changing the order does not change the outcome. So you'll get an equivalent expression. So commutative, in there we have the idea of commuting. Now to commute means move. So when you're looking at two expressions, you could ask yourself, did the numbers or variables move? And if so, they commuted. So it works for addition, it works for multiplication, and we write it as the commutative property of addition or the commutative property of multiplication. So notice if we're looking at these expressions, a plus b is equivalent to b plus a. What happened? The a and the b commuted and they changed location. They moved. 9 plus x is equivalent to x plus 9. The 9 and the x and the x and the 9 commuted. Okay, it works for multiplication. A times b is equivalent to b times a, and y times 5 is equivalent to 5 times y. There's another property, another rule that we use in algebra called the associative property. And the associative property says that the grouping can change and it will not affect the outcome. The order of the terms and variables stays the same. So when we talk grouping, we're talking parentheses. So think to associate means to group things together. So ask yourself, did the grouping change? It only works for addition and multiplication. It does not work for subtraction and division. All right, so we have the associative property of addition. And that says if we have A, B, and C, if we're adding A, B, and C together, well, we can put the parentheses around A plus B. And if we change it and put the parentheses around B plus C, we will get the same value. The expressions will be the same. Similarly, if we have x plus 4 in parentheses, we can keep the order the same, put the parentheses around 4 plus 6, and we're going to end up with the same expression. It works for multiplication as well. This is known as the associative property of multiplication. Notice for the first expression, the parentheses around B times C, and that's actually equivalent to having the parentheses around A and B. And then the second one, we have parentheses around 3 and Y. That's actually equivalent to having the parentheses around the 7 and the 3. So these properties allow us to change the grouping, and we will get the same expression. So your goal will be to actually identify which of these properties is being used for equivalent expressions. So your task is to identify the property that's being shown. So we have 7 plus 12 plus x in parentheses, and we have 7 plus 12 in parentheses plus x. So ask yourself, what actually changed from the first expression to the second expression? And if you notice, what changed is what is inside the parentheses. In the first expression, we have 12 plus x in the parentheses. In the second one, we have 7 plus 12 in the parentheses. So that means we are using the associative property of addition, because we're doing all addition here. Notice the second example here. The 8 and the x from the first expression changed locations. They moved in the second expression. So we call this the commutative property of addition. The third example, we again are changing the parentheses. We're changing the grouping. In the first expression, we have 5 and y in the parentheses. In the second expression, we have 4 and 5 in the parentheses. So we're changing the association. We're changing the grouping. So what tells us we could do that is the associative property of multiplication. And the last one is a trick problem, because in both cases, the first expression and the second expression, what's inside the parentheses? Both of these have 3 and y in the parentheses. What has changed is the order inside the parentheses. The 3 and the y have moved. So this is actually the commutative property, and it's a commutative property of addition. So notice the order changed, and order changing is the commutative property. Alright, so I know this is all new and might be a little intimidating, but really just look. Did I change what's in the parentheses, or did I change the order of things? If you change what's in the parentheses, that's the associative property. If you change the order of things, that's the commutative property. So go ahead and try the on your own real quick and see what you get. Alright, so the first one is commutative property. The order changed, even though we have parentheses. What changed was the y and the 4 switched places. Okay, next the associative property. We changed what's inside the parentheses from t plus 2 and then to 2 plus 3. For 3, we changed the order of the w and the 9. And number 4, we changed what's inside the parentheses. First expression was 3 times x, then it was 5 times 3. Alright, next up we have what I call the ODA properties, because we already know these things. It's kind of like ODA, but we give them these fancy names in algebra. So the first one is called the addition property of 0. When we identify it, we could just write it as 0 with the plus. And all it says is, if we take something and we add 0 to it, we just get that thing again. So if we start with a, add 0 to it, we still have a. If we have y plus 7, add 0 to it, we still have y plus 7. So since we end up with what we started with, a, then a, y plus 7, then y plus 7, we also call it the identity property of addition. The second ODUP property is just called the multiplication property of 0, which says that if we multiply something by 0, we get 0. Whatever it is we have multiplied by 0 is 0. And you can write this in your homework or on the test or quiz as the 0 property of multiplication, the 0 and multiplication. And the last ODUP property is if you multiply something by 1, we get the multiplication property of 1. Anything times 1 is just itself. So a times 1 is itself. 1 times 3f is 3f. So it's another identity property because whatever we start with, if we multiply it by 1, we get that same identity. We get that same value. So let's identify these real quick. So if we multiply anything by 0, we're going to get the same thing. This is the 0 property of multiplication. Or, let me write it equals 0, which tells us the 0 property of multiplication. The second one, if we add anything to 0, we end up with that same thing. This is the addition property of 0. And then our third one, we're multiplying by 1. Whenever we multiply by 1, we get that same thing. And we can write that with correct math grammar, 24m. And this is the multiplication property of 1. All right, go ahead and try the on your owns real quick. All right, on your own A is the 0 property of addition or addition property of 0. B is the multiplication property of 1. And C is the multiplication property of 0. All right, that'll do it for today's lesson.